Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The twin sons of Verath-Sul did not rise so much as negotiate. The first came up around the 5th hour, orange and unhurried, throwing long shadows across the crystal fields like a painter who hadn't quite decided on a composition yet. The second followed 40 minutes later, gold and slightly more assertive, and together they produced a light that made the surface of the world look like it was thinking about something very slowly and finding it pleasant. It was the kind of planetary morning that made visiting scientists reach for their recording equipment, and made the people who had grown up beneath it reach for their coffee and move on with their day. Sailindra Vasakarath was, on this particular morning, doing both. She stood at the tall east-facing window of the estate's upper corridor, with a cup of something that described itself as coffee on the packaging, and mostly delivered on the promise, watching the crystal fields do what they did every morning: catch the staggered light in their faceted surfaces, and throw it back in colors that had no agreed-upon names because the colonists had never quite managed to have the meeting where they assigned them. 3 generations of Akarath family members had watched this same display from this same window. Sailindra had watched it for 31 years. It had not yet become ordinary. She considered this one of the few genuine victories of her life. The estate itself was quiet in the specific way of large houses that have been built for families and are currently only housing one person. It was a distinguished quiet, the kind that came with good architecture and thick walls, but it had a certain quality to it on still mornings that Sailindra had learned to simply acknowledge and not examine too closely. The way you acknowledge a door in your house that sticks and have decided not to fix, because at some point the not fixing has become part of the routine. She had things to do. The Eastern Field Survey reports were waiting on her desk with the patient resentment of documents that have been waiting for 3 days and know it. The Colonial Supply Exchange had sent a message about the quarterly mineral output assessment, which she had been meaning to respond to since Tuesday, and today was Saturday by the colony calendar, which meant Tuesday had been ambitious of her in retrospect. There was also the matter of the atmospheric processor in the estate's lower level, which had begun making a sound 2 weeks ago, that the maintenance system described as within acceptable parameters, and which Sailindra described as a machine that had learned to express existential doubt, and had decided to do so at irregular intervals between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning. She was, in other words, a woman with a full life. It simply was not, by certain measures, a full life. The commercial district of Verath-Sul had a single main thoroughfare that the colonists called the Strand, which was either optimistic naming or a joke that had been running so long it had achieved the status of tradition. It had a tea house, a supply exchange, the public archive, a repair shop whose proprietor had strong opinions about everything and the conversational energy to share them whether or not an opinion had been requested, and a scattering of smaller establishments that between them provided most of what the colony needed and very little of what it occasionally, quietly wanted. 3 times a standard month, a supply freighter came through and docked at the platform on the colony's northern edge, and the district would experience something approaching bustle for approximately 6 hours before returning to its customary pace, which was the pace of a place that had decided a long time ago that urgency was mainly for other people. The ship that arrived on the colony's morning of the 14th was not a supply freighter. It was smaller, older, and had the particular aesthetic of a vessel that had been repaired so many times by so many different people, in so many different port systems, that it had developed something like a personality through sheer accumulated patchwork. It came in on the automated landing corridor at a perfectly legal speed, which was itself slightly notable. Most traders who came through Verath-Sul came in fast, stayed briefly, and left with the air of people who had meant to stop somewhere else. This one settled onto the dock with the deliberate ease of something that had decided to be here, and was comfortable with that decision. The man who stepped off it was not remarkable in any of the ways that tend to announce themselves immediately. He was perhaps 35, with the kind of face that accrued trust before it accrued attention. Not aggressively handsome, not the burnished confidence of someone who moved through the universe on good looks and knew it, but something quieter and in its own way more effective. He carried a single bag and the air of someone for whom traveling light was a philosophy rather than a necessity. He stopped at the top of the docking ramp, looked out at the crystal fields catching the twin sun light in the middle distance, and stood still for a moment with the expression of someone experiencing something genuinely for the first time. The docking official, a third-generation colonist named Breck who had processed approximately 4,000 arrivals in his career and developed opinions about most of them within the first 30 seconds, watched him do this and found himself, slightly against his professional instincts, forming a positive impression. "First time to Verath-Sul?" Breck asked, which was technically unnecessary since the arrival manifest already told him the answer. "First time," the man said. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that made you feel like you had said something worth smiling about. "It's more extraordinary than I expected." "Most people say that," Breck said. "Usually right before they say how long, until the next outbound corridor." The man laughed. "Cale Doran," he said, offering his ID chip with the easy manner of someone who has nothing in particular to hide and would like you to find that unremarkable. "Independent trader, I'm in no hurry." Breck processed the chip. Everything was in order. Everything was always in order with the ones who planned ahead. "Tea house on the Strand is the good one," he said, because hospitality was a habit. "The other one says it's good. There's a difference." Cale Doran smiled again, pocketed his chip, and walked out into the amber morning of Verath-Sul like a man who had arrived exactly where he intended to be. The public archive of Verath-Sul was, by any interstellar standard, a modest institution. It held 17,000 physical documents, a digital catalog that the colonial administration had been meaning to update since the previous decade and hadn't, 3 reading tables, a lending system that operated largely on the honor principle, and a librarian named Asfa, who was 83 years old, had read everything in the building at least twice, and had developed the skill of being asleep in her chair, in a way that was genuinely indistinguishable from being awake and thinking. Sailindra had been coming here since she was 7. She considered it one of the most honest places on Verath-Sul, which was not a complicated compliment but was a sincere one. She arrived on the evening of the 16th with a geological survey she had borrowed 11 weeks ago and had been carrying back and forth from the estate for 3 of them, meaning to return it and consistently finding reasons not to. It was a survey of the Eastern Formation clusters, dense with data and marginalia from 4 previous readers, and she had added her own notes in the margins in a handwriting that got progressively smaller toward the edges of the pages in the way of someone who had more to say than the paper had anticipated. She set it on the returns ledger, signed her name, and was deciding whether to borrow something else or simply admit she had come for the company of the place rather than its contents, when she noticed the man at the far reading table. He was holding a reader. This was not inherently remarkable. The remarkable part was what was on it. She could see the header from where she stood, the distinctive column formatting of the Tessaran Reach Geological Digest, which was a publication so specific in its subject matter that even most geologists considered it something of an acquired taste. Sailindra had 3 years of back issues at the estate. She had never once seen a visiting trader reading it. She told herself she was not going to say anything about it. "That's the Tessaran Digest," she said. He looked up. He had the unhurried quality of someone who had expected to be interrupted eventually and had decided in advance to be pleased about it. "It is," he said. "I found it in the lending catalog. I've been trying to understand what the formations out there actually are." He nodded toward the window, where the distant crystal fields were doing their evening thing in the last of the first sun's light, the second having already set. "The docking official told me they were crystals. I felt like that was the beginning of an answer rather than the whole one." Sailindra considered this. It was either genuinely curious or very well-performed curiosity, and she was aware that she was not always the most reliable judge of the difference, but something in the straightforwardness of it, the admission that he didn't know something and wanted to, made her sit down at the adjacent table in the way of someone who has made a decision before fully deciding. "What has the digest told you so far?" she asked. "That the crystalline formations of Verath-Sul are the result of approximately 3 billion years of specific mineral pressure and thermal cycling," he said, "and that xenomineralogists have a great deal of feelings about them." "They do," she said. "One of them cried during a site visit 4 years ago. My estate manager offered him tea and he couldn't speak for several minutes." "To be fair," Cale said, with the expression of a man taking a reasonable position, "if I had spent my career studying something and then finally saw it in person, I might also lose the ability to make conversation for a while." "He recovered eventually," Cylindra said. "Then he talked without stopping for 6 hours and missed his departure window." He laughed at this, a genuine laugh without performance in it, and Cylindra felt the small, particular pleasure of making someone laugh at something that was actually funny rather than at something they were laughing at because it seemed expected. It was a modest pleasure. She was aware she was perhaps more susceptible to it than most people. She noted this and continued the conversation anyway, which was, she would later reflect, entirely characteristic of her. His name, he told her, was Cale Doran. He traded in materials and occasionally in information, moving between systems on routes that were more intuitive than fixed, following cargo opportunities, with the loose logic of someone who had decided that a planned life and an interesting one were difficult to have simultaneously. He said this without self-congratulation, which was the version of it she would have found insufferable, but with the mild amusement of someone who had made a choice and found it had mostly worked out and occasionally, spectacularly, hadn't. He had been to 11 systems in the Reach. He had, he admitted, been to none of them as slowly as he was going to Verath-Sul, because the ship needed a part that had to come from off-world, which the local repair proprietor had communicated to him that morning with an enthusiasm that suggested he found this situation considerably more interesting than Cale did. "That's Perrin," Cylindra said. "He also has opinions about the Archive's cataloging system, the colonial water recycler's energy draw, and the correct way to greet someone in the morning. He'll tell you about all of them if you go back." "He already told me about the water recycler," Cale said. "I didn't go back, I came here instead." She asked what he thought of the formations he'd seen from the docking platform. He said they looked like the planet was keeping a secret it had been keeping for so long it had stopped being anxious about it. She thought about this for a moment. It was a strange thing to say and also, she felt, not wrong. She told him the formation behavior changed depending on atmospheric pressure, that on low-pressure mornings the fields produced a subsonic resonance that you felt more than heard, a kind of vibration in the back of the sternum that the colonists were entirely used to and that occasionally caused first-time visitors to sit down abruptly on the ground and stare at their hands. He asked when the next low-pressure morning was expected. She told him probably 2 days. He said he was glad the ship part was going to take at least a week. She was there for 40 minutes before she realized she had been there for 40 minutes. This happened sometimes with books. It had not in recent memory happened with people. She said goodnight to Asva, who may or may not have been asleep. She walked back through the Strand toward the estate in the dark and the good, cool air, past the crystals that sang very faintly in the evening wind, and she thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of something. By the 3rd week, Cale Doran had become a fixture on the Strand in the way that certain things become fixtures. Not through announcement or effort, but through simple, consistent presence, like a particular chair in a room that you stop noticing until someone moves it, and then the room feels structurally wrong. He came to the tea house in the mornings. He spent afternoons at the archive or walking the public paths near the outer formation clusters. He talked to Perrin at the repair shop about the missing part with the patient regularity of a man who had made peace with the timeline. And Perrin, who had initially viewed the delay as a professional inconvenience, had by the second week developed enough affection for his most receptive audience in recent memory that Sailindra privately suspected the part might be taking longer than strictly necessary. She saw him most evenings. This had happened gradually enough that she hadn't quite tracked the progression. First the archive, then tea after the archive, then tea before the archive, then walks along the formation paths that lasted long past the point where either of them had anything geologically informative to add, and simply became the kind of walking that is actually about something else entirely. She was aware of what was happening in the general sense. She was also aware that being aware of a thing and being able to do anything useful with that awareness were two distinct skills, and she had always been considerably better at the first. The low-pressure morning arrived on schedule, 2 days after their first meeting, as she had predicted. She had texted him the night before, a brief message, practically informational, the sort of message a person sends when they want to do something kind, and would like it to be technically categorizable as logistical. And he had been outside the estate's eastern gate at the 5th hour, hands in his jacket, watching the crystal fields with the expression of someone whose chest had just done something unexpected. She stood beside him and said nothing for a while because nothing was the right thing to say, and he stood beside her and also said nothing, and the resonance moved through them both in the way it always did, low and ancient and utterly indifferent to the fact that it was, in this particular moment, doing considerable narrative work. That, he said eventually, is the most unsettling thing that has ever felt wonderful. A xenomineralogist wrote a paper about it, she said. He called it subterranean emotional interference. His colleagues considered this too subjective for scientific literature. His colleagues were wrong. I told him that. He nearly cried again. Cale looked at her. The amber irises of her eyes were shifting toward green in the morning cold, which they did sometimes, and which she usually tried to school into neutrality in company, and had, she realized, stopped doing somewhere in the last several days. He noticed. She could see him notice. He didn't say anything about it, which was, she thought, exactly correct. He asked about the estate that morning for the first time, not the collection, not the history, just the building, whether she liked living in it, whether it had ever felt like home in the way of a place you chose or only in the way of a place you came from. It was a small question and a large one simultaneously, the kind that only land comfortably if the person asking has been paying enough attention to earn it. And he had, or seemed to have, and she answered honestly in a way that surprised her a little as the words were forming. She told him that the estate felt most like home at exactly this hour, at the low-pressure morning with the fields doing this, and least like home at dinner, when the table was sized for 10 people and she was one of them. She said the last part with the specific lightness of someone who has been carrying something for long enough to have learned how to hold it without looking like they're holding it. He heard the weight anyway. I eat standing up at the kitchen counter, he offered. On the ship, partly because the table folds down from the wall and the mechanism is unreliable and once trapped my elbow for 20 minutes. 20 minutes. I had to negotiate with it. We reached an understanding. She laughed, and the low-pressure resonance was still moving through the ground beneath them, and the first sun was properly up now, and the fields were at the full morning display, and she was aware, in the peripheral way of someone trying not to examine something directly in case it moved, that she was significantly happier standing outside her estate at the 5th hour than she had been inside it at any hour in quite some time. The ship part arrived in the 4th week. She knew this because Perrin told her, with the slightly deflated energy of a man whose best listener was about to have less reason to come by the shop. She did not ask Cale about it directly. He told her at the archive that evening, with the particular neutrality of someone waiting to see how information lands before deciding what it means. He said the installation would take a few more days. He said nothing after that, which was its own kind of statement. She said, with the over-casual tone of someone delivering a decision they have already made and are now performing as spontaneous, that the estate's guest quarters were empty and had been empty for some time, and that the bed in the main guest room was considerably better than anything currently available on a ship whose table had held its previous occupant hostage. He smiled. He said he wouldn't want to impose. She said the estate had 17 rooms and 1 occupant, and that the word impose required a certain ratio of presence to space that he was not mathematically capable of achieving. He arrived the following evening with the same single bag he had carried off the ship, which she found both characteristic and slightly funny, and which he carried with the ease of someone who had learned that everything you genuinely needed fit inside it, and everything that didn't was negotiable. The atmospheric processor in the lower level made its 2 a.m. noise on his first night at the estate. She heard him, through the walls, make a brief, muffled sound of startlement, followed by a long silence, followed by what was very clearly a one-sided conversation with the machine in which he appeared to be asking it to explain itself. In the morning, she told him about the acceptable parameters. He said the machine and her maintenance system had clearly arrived at an arrangement that did not include the humans, and he found this troubling. She told him to give it a week. He said he would. He meant it, as far as she knew. She had no reason to think otherwise. She had no reason to think otherwise about any of it, which is the thing about reasons. They are only as good as the information you have when you form them, and the information she had been assembled by someone who understood exactly what information she needed to have. She watched the security footage 3 times before she stood up from the corridor floor, and each time she watched it, she noticed something different. The first time she noticed what was gone. The second time she noticed how long he had been in the vault, 31 minutes, methodical, unhurried. A man with a list he had memorized well enough that he never once hesitated over a choice. The third time she noticed his jacket. It was the one she had told him on his second week at the estate made him look like someone who had given up on weather. He had laughed. He was wearing it in the footage. He had stolen her family's crystalline legacy in a jacket she had mocked affectionately, which was either irrelevant or the most personally offensive detail of the entire situation, and she hadn't quite decided which. She stood up. She made coffee. The atmospheric processor in the lower level made its noise, right on schedule, 2 hours before dawn, as though nothing had changed, as though the house's mechanical systems had not received the news yet and were still operating under prior assumptions. She looked at it through the kitchen doorway. She said, out loud to no one, that she was going to get the part fixed. The processor made another sound. She chose to interpret this as acknowledgement. The Colonial Security Office was sympathetic in the way of institutions that have genuine sympathy and genuinely limited jurisdiction, which produced a particular quality of helpfulness, thorough, warm, and not quite sufficient. Officer Davin, who had worked the Verath-Sul post for 11 years, and had the measured patience of a man who had learned to be useful within constraints rather than frustrated by them, walked her through everything the colonial authority could initiate. Interstellar trade violation, theft of heritage classified materials. He filed the reports with the Interstellar Authority Network and told her, honestly, that the network moved at its own pace, which was a diplomatic way of saying she should not wait by the door. She was not planning to wait by the door. She went to the archive the following morning, which felt strange and also correct. The way returning to a place after something has happened in it is always both. Asva was in her chair in her customary state of ambiguous consciousness. Cylindra sat at the table where she had first spoken to Kale Doran, and she opened her own reader, and she began working through the trading corridor maps of the Tessaran Reach, with the focused attention of a woman who had spent 31 years learning a subject, and was now applying that education to a purpose she hadn't anticipated needing it for. She knew the Reach. She knew it the way you know a place you have studied because you love it, and also because you have never quite been able to leave it, which gives you a different quality of knowledge than either study or love produces separately. She knew which corridors were viable for moving high-value, unregistered cargo. She knew which transit stations had the kind of inspection culture that a man like Cale Doran would be specifically trying to avoid, because she had read enough colonial trade reports to know where the gaps were. She also knew, because she had been paying a different kind of attention during her weeks with him than he had perhaps anticipated, certain things about his habits and preferences and the way he thought about risk. He had mentioned Carath Station once, offhand, in the middle of a conversation about something else, the way people mention places they're comfortable with, not as a destination but as a reference point, the way you use familiar landmarks when you're describing directions. She had filed it. She had filed a great many things she hadn't known she was filing, because she was her mother's daughter and her mother had always said that the Akarath family's real inheritance was not the collection, but the quality of attention that had built it. She contacted Fen Varath on the second day. Fen was a materials broker who operated out of the Carath corridor, and who owed the Akarath family a professional courtesy that had been outstanding for 6 years, accruing interest in the way of favors between people who both understand exactly what the favor is worth. She explained what she needed. Fen was quiet for a moment, then said he could make inquiries, then said he had always found it interesting that the most dangerous people in the Reach were the ones who seemed like they had nowhere pressing to be. She took this as a compliment, and also as a professional assessment from a man who recognized the type. She also called Murren, who was her oldest friend from her off-world education years, and who now worked in cultural property law in a system 3 corridors away, and who, upon hearing the situation, said several things that would have been inappropriate in most professional contexts, and then said she would begin the heritage classification filing immediately and would also, personally, enjoy this. Asfa spoke on the third morning, which she did sometimes without warning, surfacing from wherever she went during the quiet hours with the disorienting clarity of someone who had been thinking carefully about something for longer than anyone realized. She said, without opening her eyes, that the problem with people who studied things they wanted to take was that they learned the value but not the weight. Sailindra asked what she meant. Asfa said that the Akarath collection had been built by people who understood that the crystals of Verath-Sul were not merely rare but specific, that their provenance was inseparable from their value, that a crystal pulled from its documented lineage and moved through unofficial channels became, in the market that actually mattered, difficult to sell to anyone who knew what they were buying. She said that a man who had researched the collection thoroughly would know this. She said the question was whether he had researched the buyers as thoroughly as the collection. Sailindra thought about the 31 minutes in the vault, the methodical selection, the jacket. She thought about the fact that Cale Doran was very good at researching what he needed to take, and perhaps less practiced at accounting for what he was leaving behind, which was a woman with 4 languages, a broker contact at Carath Station, a cultural property attorney who found the situation personally motivating, and 31 years of knowing this corner of the Reach better than anyone who had arrived in a dented ship 9 weeks ago, and stayed just long enough to feel like he understood the place. Fen's message arrived on the 5th day. Brief, professional, the particular tone of a man delivering information he has already been paid for in accumulated goodwill. Carath Station, inbound, 2 days out. Moving light, single manifest, materials listed as geological samples, which was either brazen or simply accurate, she supposed, depending on how you felt about technical honesty. She forwarded the coordinates and manifest number to Murren, to Officer Davin, and to the Interstellar Trade Authority contact Davin had given her, who turned out to respond considerably faster when the information included a current location and a 2-day window than when it included only a report filed in the general direction of the future. She sat in the kitchen after she sent the messages. The twin sons were doing the morning thing outside. The fields were singing in the low pressure that had come in overnight. the resonance moving up through the floor and into the soles of her feet the way it always did, familiar and ancient and still, after 31 years, not quite ordinary. She had a cup of coffee. The atmospheric processor in the lower level was quiet for once, as though it too was waiting to see how things settled, which she recognized was not how machines worked and chose to find meaningful anyway. She was not the same person who had stood at this window 9 weeks ago watching the fields, and carrying the particular weight of a life that felt full of beautiful things and thin on witnesses. That person had been lonely in a way that had made her available to the wrong kind of attention, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, because pretending otherwise would require a dishonesty she didn't have the patience for. But she was also not, she had decided, going to reduce the last 9 weeks to nothing but a lesson. Something real had happened to her in them, even if the person who had occasioned it had been performing rather than participating. She had talked about things she hadn't talked about. She had shown someone her world at the 5th hour in the low-pressure light. She had stood in a kitchen and laughed about a machine that had held someone's elbow hostage and felt, briefly, like she was living in a house rather than an estate. The man who had given her those moments had also taken 7 of her family's crystals in a jacket she had made fun of, which was an injustice she intended to resolve. But the moments themselves were hers, and she was keeping them. Murren sent a confirmation 3 days later. Karath Station authorities, coordinating with the Interstellar Trade Unit, had detained a trader matching the description traveling under the name Kale Doran, with a cargo of 7 geological specimens matching the heritage classification she had filed. Murren added at the bottom of the official message, in a footnote that was entirely her own, that the trader had apparently said very little upon detention, except to ask whether the person who had identified the cargo location was the same person who owned the collection, and upon being told yes, had been quiet for a long time before saying that he should have researched more thoroughly. Sailindra read this twice. Then she went to find Asva because Asva had been right about the weight and deserved to know it. The old woman was in her chair. Her eyes were closed. The archive was quiet around her in the good way, the way of a place that has held enough knowledge long enough to have become comfortable with all of it. Sailindra sat down across from her and said that it had turned out in the end to be about the provenance. Asva smiled without opening her eyes. She said she had suspected it would be. She said that was usually how it went with things worth keeping. You could move them, but you couldn't move where they came from, and that was the part that people who hadn't grown up somewhere never quite understood. Sailindra looked out the archive